What is going on, everybody? This is Wrong Reel, episode 359's podcast for hardcore cinephiles, where we tackle everything from Jean-Luc Godard to Jean-Luc Picard. And today we have an editor, a musician, an author, a podcaster, recurring guest, Jay Blake Fischera. But welcome back to the show, man.
Thanks. Always happy to be here.
Yeah, it's been way too long. What was our last episode we did together?
Oh, man. It might have been the Carpenter episode.
Couldn't be. But I thought we did the Argento double feature one after the Carpenter, but I honestly can't remember. It's definitely been like 7 months, I think.
It's been a long time.
Well, catch us up for people out there who do not follow you already. Give us an idea of who you are, what you do, etc.
My name is Jay Blake, but my friends call me Blake. Most people probably know me from the Saturday Night Movie Sleepovers podcast that I do with my friend Dion Baya. And that's a nostalgic film podcast where we dive into film background, film history, a little bit of film theory, as well as just have a good time. It's kind of light and fun. We do mostly we try to do fun movies, but every once in a while we get a little crazy. So we've done like Karate Kid, but we've also done Cruising.
Cruising is a little rough.
As we always say, it's probably the most awkward sleepover movie of all time.
Indeed, especially if you don't know the content of the movie before you throw it in. You're like, whoa! Whose idea is this?
But it's one of our fan favorite episodes. People really like that episode. And one of the reasons why we did it was because we felt like not a lot of people talk about that movie.
Yeah, it's kind of an unknown gem and definitely wildly controversial at the time of its release.
Yeah, so we've kicked it off this year. We did Highlander so far. We took a little bit of a different approach, and we did the 5-part Arise, Serpentor Arise miniseries from G.I. Joe. And we're celebrating February with Kung Fu February, which is very exciting. And my other project that I've been working on is Scored to Death, the podcast. And Scored to Death, the podcast is it's a new venture for me. It's the companion podcast to my book, Scored to Death, Conversations with Some of Horror's Greatest Composers. And as of right now, it seems to be taking a very similar form to the book, which is in-depth interviews with composers that are best known for their work in horror movies. So in the book, I interviewed 14 composers, everybody from John Carpenter to Claudio Simonetti from Goblin, Christopher Young, who did the first 2 Hellraisers, and a lot of other really great films, including Drag Me to Hell, which is one of my favorite scores from him, which is somewhat linked to our episode today.
Absolutely.
Harry Manfredini, who did Friday the 13th. So 14 of those guys, and now I'm doing kind of that in an audio format as a podcast, and the first 2 episodes are in-depth interview with Richard Band, who did a lot of Stuart Gordon's great movies, as well as like the Puppet Master series and House on Sorority Row and Metal Storm, The Destruction of Jared Sid in 3D. So that's kind of really where my focus is right now. And I've been churning out interviews and trying to figure out how I'll present them and in what order, but really happy with what I've been getting. And kind of how this episode that we're doing right now came about was we were talking about me coming back on the show to do something, and we've always talked about me covering like my favorite directors on the show, which, you know, we did Carpenter and we did a Keaton episode and
Romero,
and we did a Romero episode and we did Argento.
Yeah, Chuck Jones is the one big one left. I proposed him and you shot that down.
Chuck Jones and David Cronenberg are the two big ones. And though I would love to do episodes on that, I've just been super swamped with trying to get this podcast up and going. And so I suggested, because I just recently interviewed Joe LaDuca, the composer for the Evil Dead series, for the Scored to Death podcast. Not exactly sure when I'm going to post those yet. I'm suspecting probably in March Joe's interviews will go up. And so a lot of the research was kind of already done.
Yeah, makes it easier to do.
Well,
preparation.
at least I thought it was. At least I had watched the movies and stuff. So,
well, if you're anything like me, you've been preparing for this episode your entire life, because I started watching the Evil Dead franchise, not even knowing what the Evil Dead franchise even really was, when I was still in middle school. So it's one of those things where even if you had done, if I had cold called you and said, let's do an Evil Dead episode right now, I imagine you would have been ready to go then and there.
Yeah,
so.
I probably could have done one completely off the cuff, and it probably would have been entertaining and somewhat knowledgeable. But glad we did take some time for me to kind of not just revisit the movies themselves, but to revisit some of the research and stuff like that.
Well, it gave me a chance to watch season 1 and season 2 of Ash vs. Evil Dead, which it's so bizarre. Like, in high school, I was one of the co-founders of the quote-unquote Dead by Dawn Society. At my school, we would have, like, Evil Dead marathons. Like, we were fanatics for this shit. But when the show came out, for whatever reason, I was like, it's a TV show. It's probably going to be defanged, declawed, PC, blah, blah, blah. I was like, there's no way they're going to recapture the magic. And so I just totally ignored it. Much to my delight and surprise and just absolute unbridled joy, as I ripped through season 1 and season 2 recently, it's like they somehow struck that perfect tone where it is definitely a show for right now. It is definitely a contemporary show, but it's a show that embraces everything that I love about the original movies and tips its hat to it and pays homage to it. And Ash is as much Ash as he ever was. And I'm like, God damn, fuck yeah. Like, somehow, by some miracle, they got it right. And so, yeah, it was like the great big surprise that was unlooked for. And I will be absolutely fired up to be watching season 3 on February 24th.
I just think it's funny. I just think it's funny because you were like, I was the president of the Dead by Dawn club at my school. And it was like, I don't know, it was almost like you said it like every school has one. You know?
If they don't, they should. And shame on you if you didn't have a Dead by Dawn Society.
Like it was the Glee Club or something.
Absolutely, Dead by Dawn Society. Well, my relationship with this franchise is bizarre because my first exposure, I remember a buddy of mine, he had this hot older sister and she had this like cool boyfriend, and he put together this really shitty bootleg VHS cassette of highlights from horror movies. And I remember going over to this place one night when I must have been like 11 or 12, and this scene came on that felt like, it was from a shitty cassette of Evil Dead, and it was a crappy transfer. So it was almost like watching like a snuff movie through static. And I was like, what is this? And like, this is Evil Dead. And I remember just being completely, totally petrified in ways that it was like kind of deeply disturbing to me. And then I kind of caught Evil Dead 2 by accident, like halfway through moving forward. I had an Evil Dead 2 poster on my wall from Fangoria, not even having like even really any intense connection to the movie. And it wasn't until like high school that I even realized I'd already seen Evil Dead 2. We took fucking LSD and sat down one night, threw that sucker in. And I don't know if I've ever laughed harder in my life than watching Evil Dead 2 with these knuckleheads on drugs, where like laughing so hard you're worried you might not be able to stop, and like you might like rip your diaphragm and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And then I remember, and I had a surreal moment when I was walking through a movie theater and I saw a poster and I saw this chainsaw hand on the poster and said Army of Darkness. I was like, whoa! It was like somebody thought high enough about that other Evil Dead 2 movie to make a sequel to it. And I was like, what the fuck's going on here? And so I started to become aware of the fact that there was actually like a cult kind of following or phenomenon surrounding this franchise. And then there's a guy, Oliver Jones, one of my high school buddies. I figured out he shared the same interest. So we put together the Dead by Dawn Society, and our first Dead by Dawn Society screening had like 4 people in a biology lab on like a 12-inch screen watching on VHS. And the next time we did it, there were like 15 people. And then by the end of my senior year in high school, like 40 or 50 people would show up and just because it was an all-guy boarding school in rural Virginia with nothing to do. So you have all these fucking maniacs just packed into a biology lab watching on this tiny-ass screen these crazy fucking Evil Dead movies. And we just had the time of our lives.
I came to the series kind of late, I think.
No LSD?
No, there was no LSD involved.
Shame on you. You didn't have a Dead by Dawn Society and you weren't taking drugs. What's wrong with you?
And we've talked about this probably mostly on the first time I was on the show when we were talking about my book, Scored to Death, Conversations with Some of Horror's Greatest Composers. I started to get into horror. I mean, horror was always kind of a thing, a little bit for me, but not in any kind of like conscious way, and that like there was an effort. I mean, I think for a lot of our generation, horror was just a thing because we had like Tales from the Dark Side, and we had new versions of Hitchcock Presents and The Twilight Zone, and Outer Limits were on TV, and you had like Werewolf the series, and Freddy had his own, Freddy's Nightmares, and then we were also part of the video store generation, so we had access to all this stuff, and horror was a big commodity on video. So I think in that way, a lot of our generation has nostalgia for it. And when I was in high school, me and my friends got into a thing where we would rent a horror movie every Friday, and that's when I got really into John Carpenter, and so I went into film school being a horror fan, but while in film school, I started taking it way more seriously and was way more active about seeing things and discovering things that I hadn't seen before. And that's when I started to get into like Romero, Martin is one of my favorite movies, and Maniac and David Cronenberg movies and all that stuff. And when I was in high school, probably early high school, I was at a party or something, and there was this crazy movie on TV where there was like a chainsaw fight. And so for years I would go around and I'd ask people like,
what the fuck were we watching?
What was that movie? It's got a chainsaw fight and there's these little people and everybody would be Army of Darkness. It's Army of Darkness. So then I went out and I bought a copy of Army of Darkness while I was still in high school, and I watched it and I was like, that's not the movie.
Yeah. It's similar. It has some similar DNA, but it's not quite what I'm looking for.
It turns out that movie was Phantasm 2.
Oh, interesting. Gotcha.
And I didn't even though I had seen even though like when I got to college, I watched Phantasm and I'd seen like Phantasm 4, I didn't even discover that movie was Phantasm 2 until like 3 or 4 years ago when I was asked to interview somebody for the
That's incredible that
for the Blu-ray
when you rediscover something that you've been trying to figure out what the fuck it was for decades, and you're like, yes.
I'd never seen the second one, and I got asked by Red Shirt Pictures to interview somebody here in New York for like the Scream Factory Blu-ray for it. So I watched the movie in preparation for that. I'm like, this is that fucking movie.
That's awesome.
But so I saw Army of Darkness. Probably late in high school, and then when I got into college, somehow I ended up seeing Evil Dead and Evil Dead 2. But Army of Darkness was kind of my first experience, but the minute I saw them, I just absolutely fell in love with them. Evil Dead is probably my favorite of the series, which I think is controversial for most people.
Not controversial to me. I fucking love Evil Dead.
Because most people say the second one is their favorite.
Well, it depends what you want. That's the beauty of the Evil Dead trilogy.
I would go even...
All of them are wildly different movies. And they almost kind of, because of like weird rights issues, kind of like retell their continuity. Like with like Evil Dead 2... they couldn't get the rights to Evil Dead 1 when they were making Evil Dead 2 for Dino De Laurentiis. So like the first like 8 or 9 minutes of Evil Dead 2 are almost kind of like a recap or a reimagining of the first movie. But for me as a teenager, I was like, does Ash not remember what happened like last weekend when he's going back out to this place for a second time? Because that inside baseball totally eluded me, the fact that like, oh well, New Line now starts to Evil Dead, so they're not going to give Dino De Laurentiis the rights to like kind of like how them just. I mean, I saw this great video where Bruce Campbell saying, look, the end of Evil Dead 1, you basically go from there to the point where Ash gets like thrown through the trees, and that's how you kind of put the two together.
It's funny because, when I discovered them, it was still VHS.
Yeah,
and then a couple years later, the DVDs started coming out. And the Evil Dead movies, along with Halloween, are like evergreens when it comes for DVD. There are so many different DVDs and Blu-rays.
Oh, I had a Book of the Dead, like a rubber.
I have it.
Yeah.
I should have brought it. We could have reminisced about it.
Yeah.
But on one of those commentaries, he talks about how like some, film school nerds, you could cut the three together with that. And I remember watching that commentary with somebody and being like, Blake, you did that. And I was like, I did do that. I have like a 6-hour-long VHS tape somewhere that's all three movies as one movie.
Nice. But I actually like the continuity or the discontinuity, I guess, between them, because that was part of the charm in high school, where the first like 5 minutes where the girl's like, are you sure it's a band? And he's like, I think so. And we would just like roar with laughter, like, he's so fucked. Like, he remembers what happened last time, and he's taking yet another girl up there. Like, it became like we actually liked the fact that what was a mistake or kind of like they're trying to clean things up. We just took it as like hard continuity. It was a hard sequel, not a reboot, not a remake, etc. So,
also probably my freshman year at film school, college, there was like a film society, and they would like once a month they would rent a print of something and screen it either in like an auditorium or just like in a lecture hall. And they did Evil Dead, so it was really cool to see like a beat up 16 millimeter print of Evil Dead.
No, Evil Dead's one of those movies where you need to watch a shitty copy. Like, I watched it the other night to revisit it, pristine streaming service or whatever, and I was like, the movie is more scary if you're watching on a VHS cassette, where like the sound's coming in and out and it's almost inaudible, and the image quality's a little blurry. It seems fucking real.
I posted something a couple of months ago on Twitter, and I don't remember what spawned it, but I was referring to Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and it was because I think they were announcing like a 4K, transfer of Texas Chainsaw Massacre. And I was like, call me crazy, but I would rather watch Texas Chainsaw Massacre on like the shittiest VHS
or like on
I
an
could
8mm print, or some 8mm blown up to 35, so it's like super grainy.
And I feel that way about the first Evil Dead. Like the more you clean it up, like the less
effective it is. Because
is.
You can see the seams, you can see the cracks.
But just like
the fake shimps become more glaring.
Like a third generation VHS where the tracking's not quite right is like the perfect way to see that, because it just kind of, like you said, it almost seems like it's real or something. And I think that's why there's definitely a reason why it became so successful, other than the fact that it's awesome. It's just like it came out at the right time for VHS.
Absolutely. And also like in the UK, it was like one of the video nasties and that sort of thing. But it's absolutely incredible just how much was achieved with so little. But it actually, preparing for this episode, prompted me to go back and watch for the very first time Within the Woods. Their half-hour short they did before Evil Dead, just to kind of show potential investors what they can do. It was like a 3-day weekend shoot. And I actually did have a little bit of that like snuff film experience where it's obviously a really, really shitty transfer of a really beat up VHS that's been put on YouTube. I mean, you almost can't even watch it. It's so blurry. But you can see enough where you kind of get the
There's
idea.
been talk ever since, I think, that Book of the Dead edition, the rubber DVD, where they were supposed to put it on that as a special feature, and then there was something about rights.
Well, maybe that's the best place to start. I mean, obviously this is these guys are legends at this point. They've been talking about and making these movies for decades, and Bruce Campbell, for me, he's an absolute living legend. This is the dream. Every independent filmmaker dreams of going off into the woods and making their down and dirty little movie. And it's not like it was like an overnight success. Like between Evil Dead and Spider-Man, there was like a lot of ups and downs in Sam Raimi's career over like the course of like 20 years.
That and just from the time that the film was completed in like 1980.
To the time it got released was like years.
It didn't get released in America until 1983. So there was just, even that is just years before it found distribution.
Well, let's talk about this like crew of friends. Basically, I feel like there's like a trinity at the core of this with like Rob Tapert, Sam Raimi, and Bruce Campbell. These guys from Detroit, high school friends. Sam Raimi's a child, basically. I mean, he was a teenager as they were prepping and planning Evil Dead.
Kind of pre-production, he was 19.
Yeah, and I think he was 20 when they started shooting. But tell people a little bit about where these guys came from and what they were kind of doing in high school, because these guys were cranking out 8mm shorts like madmen. Almost, it was like they were the Three Stooges of the 1970s. Just no one knew they existed yet.
It's initially it was Bruce Campbell, Sam Raimi, Scott Spiegel, and Josh Becker. They all lived in the same area, and I guess some of them knew each other from junior high, and then I guess like in a lot of cases, junior highs in a school district will all then filter into one high school, and so they all got to know each other kind of as a group in high school, I think. And it just so happened that all of them were interested in making like super 8mm shorts, and it's funny because. Reading their story and seeing their shorts, I remember long time ago buying or trading for like a VHS bootleg of just like a whole VHS, like probably of like all the shorts that were like all crusty and, and like 8th generation VHS and trying to watch them, and some of them are talked about. Will probably be mentioned in this cast by name, but that's what me and my friends did starting in probably 9th grade. We started churning out on VHS because my mom bought me a camcorder. I had a friend
back when you could edit by pressing the trigger, like you're like, all right, this is a cut.
Exactly.
And now it's gonna start filming it. Like, you didn't use editing software. You just cut in the camera.
And we got really fucking good at it. We got so good at it that we could play a piece of music in the background
and choreograph it,
and like with using hand signals, pause the camera and the music at the same time and have it be like seamless. We knew the delay.
This is how Leone does it.
We knew like the amount of delay there was. We got so fucking good at it. Part of it was funny because there was this kid that lived across the street, and this was when I was probably in like 5th or 6th grade, and I wanted a camera because I wanted to make like Star Wars with that kid because I was obsessed with Star Wars and special effects. So I had like this fucking sci-fi epic up in my head. So the kid ends up moving, And then my mom buys me a camcorder, buys the family a camcorder. And then for years, my mom would bitch and complain how I never used it. How she spent all that money and I never used it. And so then I made friends with these guys that lived in another neighborhood. And I found out that they made like a movie on like one of their dad's cameras. But they wanted to keep doing it, but their dad was, getting their dad to let them use the camera was like a big deal. And I was like, fuck, I got a camera. And we started churning out movies.
Some people join bands. You got a bass? You're in. You're the bass player.
And so we started churning out movies like nobody's business. We churned out. This was the age of like Quentin Tarantino. So we did like a lot of Pulp Fiction ripoffs, and then we did like a Vietnam movie called Stranded, and we just started churning out tons of movies. At a sleepover. And a lot of people know that listen to Saturday Night Movie Sleepovers will know this, but at a sleepover for my birthday, we watched In the Mouth of Madness.
Gotcha.
And that's the movie that changed my life, which eventually led, like 20 years later, for me starting a book about film music was because of that movie.
It's got a damn good score.
And then that night, we made our first horror movie with the end credits playing in the background as the soundtrack to the movie. And my parents were asleep upstairs. It was like me and two of my friends running around like the first floor making a weird psychological horror movie. So I made all these movies, and then when I got to film school and I became friends with guys that have guested on your show, the Pink Smoke guys, Chris Funderburg and John Cribbs. For the longest time, Chris Funderburg was like my best friend, but the two of them were completely obsessed with the movies I made in high school. There was one day where John, in those days, John Cribbs was very into making lists, and he would just make lists in class, and you'd look over and it'd just be like a numbered list of things, and you'd be like, what the fuck are you writing? And one day he tried to make a list of all the movies we made, and so like he started writing. And he was like asking me, and I would start.
Reminded me of like Liam Neeson in that bit from like that comedy. He was like, "That's why I was casting Schindler's List. I'm always writing down lists."
And I don't know. We got up to like 80 something, and I was like, I don't know. I'm sure there's more, but I can't think of any more. But the list got like really fucking long, but they were obsessed with them. John started writing a sequel to one of them that he wanted to film at college, and I was like, well, you don't understand. The beauty of our movies was that they're not written. There was like a basic premise, and then they were improvised for like however long the movie went. And sometimes
there's no storyboarding.
Sometimes the plot would change just because somebody said something in a scene, and we'd go off in another direction. And Funderburg liked one so much that he wanted to write a feature-length version of it. So when I started getting into Sam Raimi and finding out this information.
You felt a kinship.
I did. I was like, I did that. Of course, I didn't go off to make, amazing movies, but there was like, I know what that's like. And it's, those times making those movies with my friends are probably like some of the best times of my life. And so I definitely felt like a total kinship, to Sam Raimi and Bruce Campbell. And I got like really obsessed with
Is he
Bruce
the
Campbell.
youngest filmmaker ever to make a like wildly successful genre film as his first movie out of the gate? Like Evil Dead was a hit, and he was a child when he made it. Like I can't think of a younger example of a filmmaker who makes their debut feature and actually translates it into a franchise that is still ongoing 40 years fucking later.
Yeah, I don't know. That's a good question. I mean, I'm sure there are some pretty young guys that have done it, that made great movies, especially horror movies, but
like John Carpenter was young, and like
but
John Landis was young, but these guys are like late 20s when they're making their features.
Yeah, I mean John Carpenter was like 30 when Halloween came out.
And John Landis,
but that also wasn't his first movie. I mean, part of the reason why what I find interesting about them, and in researching this, I was watching a lot of documentaries and stuff, and Eli Roth kept on talking about how like you could just tell these are guys that loved horror movies, and the truth is like they didn't love horror movies.
They almost kind of fell into it because it was commercially viable.
They took
they like comedy and slapstick and like all sorts of silliness.
We had this group of guys, and then Sam Raimi ends up going to college, and at college his brother's housemate, Ivan Raimi's housemate, was Robert Tapert. And that's how he meets Robert Tapert, and somehow Robert Tapert gets in on making these movies with Raimi, and Campbell would come up for like the weekend and fill in parts, that the extra, like featured extra parts or whatever. And so apparently, so I think the story goes, Tapert and Raimi went to go see Halloween on like a Tuesday night, and it was empty, and they're sitting there watching it, and Tapper was like, we should make a feature, man. He's like, do you think you could make a movie as good as this? And Raimi was like, I don't know, man, this one's pretty good. And then they went back and saw it like on Saturday with like a full audience and saw the reaction to it. And Tapert was the one that was like, we should make a real movie, like a feature-length movie. And Sam Raimi was like, we've thought about it.
That's why Tapert became a successful producer. He was already thinking like one.
Yeah. Apparently Sam talks about how like he had already thought about it and realized that like it was impossible, but was like, okay, kind of humored Tapert. And part of how the horror thing came was they made a movie and they would show it on campus, and they were actually making some money. They made like, it cost like $500, $600 or something.
Yeah, they would pool together like whatever money they happened to have, but like there's no budget, no schedule, but they would basically just had a collection of collaborators, and they would just they'd crank out these shorts. But Within the Woods, that was the first time they actually seemed like they really brought in outside expertise who knew about a little bit about prosthetics, special effects, etc.
Because most of their films were like these crazy screwball comedies and or slapstick and stuff like that, and with the money they made from this one film, unfortunately the title's escaping me, they decided to make another film that they would make, like they would spend so much money on it because they made so much money, and if they spent more money on it, it would be so much better and it would make a ton of money. And so they made this other like short film that didn't work, and nobody would come to see it because it kind of stunk. But there was one thing about it that worked when people watched it, which there was like a suspense scare. And they just thought it was really cool and that it worked. And so that was part of the genesis of like, maybe we should think about doing that kind of movie, like as a full movie instead of just like that one scare. Simultaneously, Tapert's like, we should make a feature. And he decides to do research, and apparently he buys like Variety magazine, and he's looking, and he finds a list of like top grossing movies. And he discovers that like horror is the one place where you can spend little money and make a pretty good amount of money.
Potentially, yeah.
That, and a lot of the really great horror movies of the day were made by first-time directors. So that also seemed promising. You had like Romero and Tobe Hooper, Wes Craven.
Although technically Texas Chainsaw wasn't Tobe Hooper's first flick, but everyone kind of always thinks of it as his first flick.
And they also had a kind of a formula, which was like young people stranded someplace.
Go out into the woods and horrible things happen.
So
people are still doing it. The Ritual comes out on Netflix tomorrow. A bunch of guys go out into the woods, go camping, and all fucking hell breaks loose. It's the classic horror premise for movies.
Well, and it's also completely cost effective, which is like one location, a bunch of young people. And so that's kind of like the genesis of, we should do this, and I think we can do this. Like, look at, like the numbers don't lie. Like, this is possible. And the fact that, inexperienced directors are making horror movies. What I find fascinating about the Evil Dead story, and you could totally see like, Lifetime will do those like TV movies of like Full House, or they just did one about the two Coreys. I could totally see this as like, because this is like, like the Evil Dead story is a story of perseverance, and like three guys, young guys, like you're saying, 19. Campbell was like 20 when they started, and Tapert was like 22, deciding to like take the bull by the horns and do something. And
also, at that age, it's so easy to lose interest in things when you hit the first roadblock, the first obstacle. These guys, they didn't have money. It's not like there was like some spoiled rich kid in the group who's like, I'll pay for it. They went out and raised the money from investors and actually had like deliverables and like a schedule and like paid their investors back. Like, they were fucking organized and motivated in ways that most 20-year-olds, they can't even like answer their fucking phone on time. Much less deliver a fucking movie.
They decided that they were going to drop out of college. They bought suits and briefcases, and they went and talked to a lawyer who was like a family friend of the Taperts. and the lawyer was like, you shouldn't like incorporate. So they started like an LLC, and they wrote up an agreement for investors. And in his book, Campbell talks about like how the agreement is basically like, it's really hard to get people to sign it because it's like, you're not going to make your money back.
Well, also everyone says, when do you expect to make your money back? And they're like, how do you say with any certainty when or if a movie's going to be? Because it literally, it's like going to fucking
But
Vegas
the agreement's like, they have to sign something that's like, I understand as an investor that there's a very good possibility
that I'm throwing my money into the wind. But at least they did have, what was it? I'm blanking on the name, Within the Woods. At least they had that as like a show reel.
Well, they did a really smart thing, which is, I think, also for themselves.
And it has scenes and beats that you see that they would use for like the next 10 years. Like there's a jump scare in Within the Woods that's used in Evil Dead 2 where somebody comes through the door and the person stabs them blindly without looking. And it sees their friend who falls to the floor. And then behind them in the window, you see the monster rise up. And I was like, God damn, like that's from Within the Woods. But Evil Dead 2, they used that fucking gag, like, almost a decade later.
They decide to make, basically Raimi starts writing Evil Dead. The idea of people...
He starts writing Book of the Dead. Evil Dead came later.
He starts writing Book of the Dead. It's kind of the inspiration comes from a couple different places. He was writing a short story for a short story class and writing class in college where it was about a guy alone in a cabin. And he starts to go kind of mad. And then there's also... I've heard that he was in an ancient history class and it was really boring, but then the teacher started talking about the Egyptian Book of the Dead. And then he kind of perked up and he thought that was really interesting. And then I also hear reports where he was a Lovecraft fan, and that's where the term Necronomicon came from.
Yeah, he first coined the phrase back in the 1920s, but it was fictional book written by the Mad Error Abdul Al-Hazred. And it's become like a weird bad joke now where a lot of people think the thing is real. And there's certain people who in libraries like at Harvard and Yale would create a card for it and put it in. So people are like, oh well, it says you have the Necronomicon in your stash, and it's there are a lot of people out there too that who think the Necronomicon is actually a real thing.
So that's kind of where the premise comes from, and obviously the idea of young people stranded or trapped someplace. And so he starts writing that script. He starts working on that script, and Within the Woods, as you kind of. As you were kind of insinuating, was they decided to they needed some kind of proof of concept. They needed something to show the potential investors that these 19-year-old, 20-year-old kids could deliver something that worked.
And it actually is scary. When you watch it, the fucking monster looks terrifying.
And Scott Spiegel talks about how in his opinion, Within the Woods is better than Evil Dead in that it's not as well made, but in terms of the scares and how an audience reacts to it, it's far superior. It's stronger in that sense.
Well, it's got a lot of little details that people are familiar with, like the ominous POV shots. They're not as well done, but they're there. You got the swinging chair on the porch, banging into the wall. That's there. The part where the girl's fumbling with the key, and then a hand reaches out and grabs her wrist. All these little scenes are whoa, he used that, he used that, he used that. It's incredible. Just it was a rough draft of a lot of techniques he was going to use later on, and you can see Sam Raimi learning his craft as he goes.
Yeah, I mean, I think. Ultimately, why the Evil Dead has longevity and works is because of the visionary Sam Raimi. When we talked about Dario Argento, when we talked about the Three Mother trilogy on your show, and we were talking about Bird with Crystal Plumage, we talked about how Bird with Crystal Plumage is a film where Dario Argento, what we know as Dario Argento, is there. It's there in maybe in a primitive sense, but it's his style and vision for cinema is so realized in Bird with Crystal Plumage, which is one of the reasons why his first film is so great and still considered one of his best. I feel the same way about Evil Dead. Everything that we know about Raimi from then through Spider-Man and all that stuff, it's in Evil Dead. It's there. Maybe it's a little choppier, but the Raimi montage, it's there. The crazy angles, the way the camera moves, it's all there. And I don't recall, it's been almost 20 years since I've watched like that beat up VHS tape of their wacky comedies. But so I don't know how much of it was in those. But yes, you can see so much of it within the woods.
Well, even like just stupid things like Three Stooges style like eye pokes and things like that are like, all over Army of Darkness. It's basically a Three Stooges movie that takes place in the Middle Ages with Deadites. But like that's part of their DNA as well. Like, I mean, I almost feel like, but like Eli Roth saying they're big horror buffs. They're not horror buffs. They're comedy buffs. And like, it seems like the way they talk and interact, they're kind of dicks in a lot of ways, but they like being dicks. Like the way Ash and Scott interact in Evil Dead. Like Scott is the world's biggest fucking asshole. And every time he says something horrible, Ash is like, he cracks up. And you're like you get the sense that hanging out with these guys was probably a bit trying unless you could kind of get on their wavelength pretty quickly, because there's an aggressive but hysterical kind of shared humor between all these guys.
Yeah, I mean, basically, it goes back to what we were saying, why they made a horror movie. They weren't necessarily horror fans, but making a comedy was way more risky. So they decided to make a horror movie, which I think that's why a lot of the especially I guess it's the generation before him, but a lot of the filmmakers in the 70s, that's why they made horror movies.
But they're all making like kind of like earthbound movies with like chainsaws and axes and machetes and things like that. I love the fact that they brought in the supernatural. The fucking demons in this are so cool and so badass looking. Like when I see Cheryl, when she first rises up, I still think it's one of the best scenes I've ever seen in any horror movie from any era, where you got the girls, they're practicing, like seeing if they can predict like the cards as they unfold. And Cheryl's looking out the window and she's like, Ace of Spades. And she's like, it gives me the fucking heebie-jeebies to this day. And I've been watching this movie for nearly 30 years now, and it still has this enormous impact. And what's it called? The elevator, the little rig they came up with to raise her up off her feet. Like the fact that Sam Raimi and his buddies invented all these techniques with like Vaseline and duct tape and 2x4s to get these effects that still fucking play in 2018 is nothing short of remarkable. And they had like $150,000 to make this movie. They shot for 12 weeks in Tennessee. They shot a lot afterwards. Like they went back to Tappert's cabin. Tappert's cabin or family farm or whatever is in both Within the Woods as well as Evil Dead. Like it's the same fucking cellar. And it looks cool as shit. It's a great looking cellar. But man, it's just incredible. Just so much ingenuity and perseverance, and how much like they were willing to suffer to make this thing, freezing their dicks off in the winter with like chili giving them diarrhea, like people stepping on nails, and like cast and crew quitting and leaving the production. I mean, it was the ultimate nightmare experience. And Bruce Campbell says, like in his book If Chins Could Kill, which is a great read, that the only thing that really got him through it was seeing what shade of gray Sam Raimi would turn every day. So like no matter how hard he pushed everybody else, I always knew he was pushing himself just a little bit harder. That's what it takes when you have somebody leading by example. Like, I'm going through hell and the rest of you are going through hell, but it's all worth it because I'm going to work a little bit harder so no one can bitch.
Yeah, well, there was a lot of, for young guys, they started shooting when he was 20. I mean, there was a lot on Sam Raimi's shoulders. I mean,
that's a lot of money. Like, someone gave you $150,000 to make a movie right now. Like, oh shit, like this is real. Like, I have a responsibility to these people.
Exactly. I mean, it was like I have to deliver something. I can't, and I have to make these people their money back. I mean, that's a lot of pressure to put on a teenager, basically.
I mean, when I was 20, I can't even put into words how unreliable and irresponsible I was. If somebody gave me $150 was literally to make a movie, it would have been a disaster. So,
but I just their story is one that I find completely inspiring. Their grit to go through with it, to fight for it. I mean, I think in some ways there's like ignorance is bliss. I think that
you don't know how little you know.
I think that was a big problem for a lot of people, a lot of my friends, going to film school and learning how to make movies almost in a lot of ways talked us out of making movies, I think.
Well, yeah, I mean, Bruce Campbell writes about that, how Sam Raimi didn't know about doing a master shot, or he didn't know about shooting coverage. He knew how to shoot precisely the shots that he needed for the story in his head, which saved him a lot of time and effort and money because he didn't have to shoot things that he wasn't going to use. And Bruce Campbell talks about how exhilarating it was to watch Sam Raimi getting better as they went. Like just little things like the opening shot where you got Bruce Campbell pushing Sam Raimi in a raft, and Sam Raimi's just holding the camera at all these crazy angles, going up and over logs and going sideways. It's beautiful, gorgeous stuff that works totally to this day, and it costs nothing. You need the raft and you need the camera, but it's like now you're like, oh, well, we need $100,000 rig that's gonna, and like he didn't know how little he knew, and he just found through sheer creativity the way to achieve a beautiful shot.
I mean, there's something about, I always say, like restriction on art can often be like the best thing.
You have to have it.
That's like, it's the difference between like New Hope and Phantom Menace.
Yeah, you need a budget and you need a deadline.
You need a budget, you need a deadline, and you need to problem solve. I mean, it's, you're talking about like the rigs. There's the shaky cam, which is like,
tell people what the shaky cam is.
It's basically a board, like a 2x4 board with the camera mounted in the center of it and a person on either side, and that's like the Evil Dead POV.
And running at high speed.
They discovered that they couldn't afford like a steady cam, so but somehow they discovered that if they mounted it like the camera onto a board and walked with it, the longer the board, the less
smoother
shaky it would be.
Yeah. That's so fucking cool.
And so there's that, and they didn't have money for like a real dolly, so they would put like
the Vasocam.
They basically, which is kind of genius, is they would put like a sawhorse. Basically, they would stand up a 2x4 and they would wrap it in duct tape, and then they would put Vaseline all over it, and then they made like a mount that I'm guessing is like a U.
Yeah,
that would fit,
wrap around it.
That would fit perfectly like around the board, and then because of the Vaseline on the tape, there would be no friction, and then they could just slide it up and down this board to move the camera. Like you said, like basically like a teeter-totter like seesaw of lifting the girls up. Like
the elevator. Man, it looks fucking chilling when they rise up like that. You're like, because it's in camera. It's not a special effect. Like when you achieve a special effect in camera, it has a different impact on your imagination. There's just a disconnect. We're like, I can watch a movie like Guardians of the Galaxy and have a great experience, but essentially you're watching like ones and zeros on a screen. You're watching things that are cooked up on a computer. But when you see somebody actually rise up off the ground, or in a film that could never afford a computer in a million years, like it just has a different impact on the eyeballs.
Or like, mounting like a board underneath just out of frame and then ramming that through like the
Ramocam.
Like a battering ram through a window.
Yeah, the Ramocam's killer. Because that ominous POV, it's always like going through doors or going through my favorite is in Evil Dead 2 when it goes through the rear window of a car, through the car, then out the front windshield.
Yeah.
Like that was like one of the most difficult Ramocams to create. Apparently it took like 28 takes to get it right. But even on a movie where they had considerably larger budget, they were still inventing, just making up new shit.
Yeah, I mean it's amazing, and it's like you hear like the big perseverance stories of Hollywood, like Rocky, for instance. Like Stallone wrote a script; they would have given him way more money to just buy the script and cast fucking somebody else in the movie, but he wanted to play the part, or like Good Will Hunting gets compared to Rocky a lot. In some ways, like this is way more inspiring. It's like these 19-year-old kids.
I've seen Good Will Hunting once. It's a perfectly fine movie. I will never watch it again. I've seen Evil Dead a billion times.
Which we did a Rocky episode.
Yeah, we did. I
forgot about.
And I love Rocky. I've seen Rocky a million times. But Evil Dead's one of those
Maybe
movies.
that's our last
It's
episode.
one of the movies. Yeah, it actually was. Because it was right before Comic-Con. Because I was editing the Rocky episode at Comic-Con, which was late July of last year. Yes, it's been 6-7 months. But Evil Dead's one of those movies where, I mean, I watched it over and over and over and over again in high school. And it would get better. And I watched it the other night. And I was still enjoying the fucking shit of it. Just little stupid things that I shouldn't enjoy. But when there's a great moment when there's a camera looking down at Ash as he's walking along. And as the boards go by, it goes, womp, womp, womp. I'm like, what the hell is that?
Yeah.
It's just these weird little sound effects that are genius when you watch it. Make no logical sense, no narrative sense. But there's something about just like in Evil Dead 2, there's a scene where it's just people looking at something that doesn't exist as the camera kind of whips around the room with these extreme close-ups and sound effects. They're just making things up with sound effects and camera angles.
Yeah.
And somehow it still plays even though it shouldn't.
Yeah, it's kind of creativity at its best. And
pure visual storytelling.
And I think a number of years ago, I interviewed Bruce Campbell.
I would have shit my pants if I even met the guy.
And I met him at the book signing for If Chins Could Kill at Barnes & Noble down in Union Square with Chris Funderburg. He and I have a picture somewhere of the two of us standing there with Bruce Campbell. So I met him there, but when I was in college and I got completely fucking obsessed, because my real introduction to Bruce Campbell was Briscoe County Jr.
It was a huge show. I never saw it, but it ran one season. But like, that was
Might
his
have
first,
been two.
Maybe it was two. But it was his first big moment to be a star outside of the shadow of Sam Raimi, where it was like you could tell he was going to have a career that wasn't wholly dependent on Sam Raimi.
But to me, that's who he was. He was Briscoe County. He wasn't Ash yet, you know. And I would watch Briscoe County Jr. with my stepdad, and I remember being home. I don't know if it was spring break or on a summer, and I didn't have cable growing up at my mom's house, so I would just have to watch what was ever on, like the regular UHF and VHF channels.
The big three.
And so like every morning I would get up and I would watch like Live with Regis and Kathy Lee, because that was the only thing fucking on. I could maybe the Today Show or whatever.
At that point, you should just throw your TV out the window. If that's
So I would sit there and I'd watch it like every morning when I was little, and if I was home, and they had Bruce Campbell on, and he was describing that, at least I don't recall if he talks about this in the book, in his book. But I always remember because he talked about how he got the show. At least this is the story he told Regis and Kathy Lee, which was that they wanted to see if he could, if he could be physical and fight. So he did the Evil Dead thing where he fought his hand in the audition
and did a flip.
And he did a flip, and he did a flip on Regis and Kathy Lee, and I was like, this guy's fucking amazing.
Yeah, they're talking in this book, like when he did that audition, like, can you do that over and over again? It's like, well, as long as my back holds out. But yeah, to be able to grab yourself by the scruff of the neck and throw yourself over, and of course in Evil Dead 2, they do it in fast motion. It's one of the most inspired physical comedic performances since the silent era. I mean,
and so like that was my introduction. So I always loved Bruce Campbell, and then when I discovered the Evil Dead movies, I just like completely became obsessed. And back then, you could go on his website. I would go down to like the computer lab, because this was like before everybody had laptops and stuff, and the internet was still new. Like getting shit on eBay was like, there's this place where you can go and auction things. I don't even think Buy It Now existed yet. It was just auctioning. And PayPal didn't exist. You had to go to the post office and get a money order. So this is like this is back in the day. And but he had a website, and you would go on and he'd have all these things that he wrote, like, kind of like like the Lloyd Kaufman stuff. He had like a big thing that was like, so you want to be a producer? And he would talk about being a producer. You want to be an actor? And he would give like his advice about if you wanted to be an actor, this stuff. And you could email him. His email address was there. And so I used to bug him all the time, and I used to email him. So I always had this email address, like in my history or whatever of my email. And so Evil Dead, the remake, came out in 2013. And Crime Wave just came out on Blu-ray. So I emailed him and I said, I didn't write for any one site then, but I used to write for a lot of different sites, and I didn't have any place to really send it. But I was like, hey, I write for all these sites. I would love to talk to you about your work as a producer.
Because people don't realize that he wasn't a guy sitting around waiting for the phone to ring. He was like a director and producer on like Hercules and Xena Warrior Princess.
Yeah. Well, he produced all the Evil Dead movies.
Yeah. And like there's a great bit in Army of Darkness where he talks about like how in theory on the third movie of a successful franchise you should actually make money, and he breaks down the math and he says like, all right, I got paid $500,000 to do this. And he's like, immediately like half it went to Uncle Sam, and then the other half went to my ex-wife, and then I worked over 2 years. He's like, I was actually making $45,000 a year to be the star and producer of a successful franchise. Like he's like, I made it in Hollywood, folks.
For Universal Pictures.
Yeah, and it's like, but it just shows like the math is like he's brutally frank about the realities of making movies.
Yeah, and so and I had read. Obviously, I was a fan of If Chins Could Kill, so I emailed him and he said, "Yeah, sure, I can give you 20 minutes." So I called him. He was on the set or in his trailer for the last season of Burn Notice.
Gotcha.
So we talked about that, about how Burn Notice was ending. And then we talked for like an hour. Like I think once he saw like what I was asking, and and also I even then, like the book, this was before I wrote the book, but when I would interview people, I strive for for them to be more like conversation than interviews. And we actually just had like a really great conversation about his life as his work as a producer, and I think he was open to it because I don't think anybody really asks him about that. I didn't ask him about acting in the Evil Dead movies, being Ash. I wanted to know what it was like to produce, and really what was his job as a producer, because he co-produced these movies, and he co-produced Crime Wave, and that had just come out on DVD.
And he made a very overt decision in the like mid-late 80s not to be a producing partner with Tappert and Raimi moving forward. Like they went off to form their own production company. He's like, well, I need to be available for like auditions and casting.
Yeah.
And I always wondered if like he regretted that, because obviously Sam Raimi, between like 1987 and 2000, he was moving up in the world. Like right around the time of like A Simple Plan, suddenly I was like, oh, Sam Raimi's like, he's increasing his stature. And then like Spider-Man comes along, like, oh, now you're one of like the A-list directors in this town. And so you always wonder like, shit, like should I have stayed in that guy's company?
But where I was kind of going with this story, aside from drawing attention to the fact that he wasn't just acting in this pictures, he was actually a producer. But is this one thing I discovered about him was that he's very into sound.
Interesting.
And like sound editing and sound design. And so I get the feeling that he was very involved. Like when I was talking to him about the reboot, he was talking about how basically when the film was done, he went into the editing room with just him and an editor, and he brought like a box of tapes that were the cabin sounds from the original.
Well, they were
movie.
like brilliant amateur Foley artists back in the day. Like they got really fucking good at. Like Sam Raimi would wake up in the middle of the night because he heard a sound coming through his window, like the house where they're all sleeping. He woke up the sound guy, like, we got to record this right now, and it's used extensively throughout the movie.
And so he went through the remake and would just like drop in sound effects from the original movie. And when I interviewed Alan Howarth for my book, he was the sound designer for Army of Darkness. And so I asked him, I said, he didn't write the music, obviously, but he was the sound designer. So I was asking him, I was like, I know from talking to Bruce that he was way into sound. Did you find that he was very active? He's like, oh yeah. Every time we would watch something, Bruce would be like, give me a microphone. And then he would just add grunts and all this stuff. So Bruce was very into sound. So when we're talking about like the camera going over those, like the pillars or the beams I wonder if that was Bruce or if that was Sam, because I know that Bruce is very into.
I know, because Sam was learning a lot about post-production as well. Like Bruce speaks very glowingly about how he learned a crucial lesson from Sam Raimi early on, how they'd be watching a cut of Evil Dead and a scene would be going like, he's like, God damn, like we really worked hard to achieve that shot. And Sam Raimi would say, do me a favor, watch it again and tell me next time if you missed the scene. And then he would, like, at the end of the screen, be like, did you miss the scene? He's like, what scene? It's like, the scene in the workshop. It's like, oh! And, like, he realized that no matter how much effort you put into achieving a difficult shot, you got to be willing to cut it if it ain't working for the movie. You got to get it down to a proper running time. But that's hard to do to disassociate yourself from the effort involved in achieving a shot versus what's the most effective editing choice in the editing room.
Yeah. Just a last note on that interview that I did with Campbell, and I thought it would make bigger news. I asked him, I said, will you write it? You're going to write another book? He said, I'm working on it. And
he's got three. He's got How to Make Love the Bruce Campbell Way. He's got If Chins Could Kill. And there's one more.
The new one, yeah. Whatever. But that was years before the new one came out. And I thought that was going to make like big, like, entertainment news, that Bruce Campbell said he's talked to a publisher. He's in the middle of writing a follow-up to If Chins Could Kill, and nobody cared. But now it's out.
It's really incredible what a great American hero he evolved into, because you look at the character of Ashley in the first Evil Dead, and for half the movie, he's just paralyzed with fear, and Scott's doing all the work. He's the hero of the movie. Like, he's the first to go down in the cellar. He's the first to kill a Deadite. Like, it's Scott. And then all of a sudden, Ash has to kind of rise to the occasion at the end, but there's this crazy moment like halfway through Evil Dead 2, or maybe a third of the way through, when he has to cut off his own hand. He's like, who's laughing now? And you're like, oh, this is his like crossing the Rubicon moment. Like, this is his transition point. Yeah. And then 2/3 of the way through the movie, when he attaches that goddamn chainsaw to his hand and says groovy, it's like, oh, you're the best superhero of the 1980s. Like, maybe RoboCop is the best superhero of the 1980s, but Ash in that moment becomes a superhero.
Yeah, I wrote
whipping out one-liners like, swallow this, like, I'll swallow your soul.
You just reminded me. I just had like this recollection that at some point, I guess freshman year, because I remember sitting at Dion was my roommate at the time, and I remember sitting at his computer to write it. I wrote a paper for a film theory class that was about like Ash's slide into, his descent into madness. And it was about like, it was all about how he goes crazy and questioning like, for parts of the movie, are things really happening or is he just going crazy and stuff?
Well, his responses in the first third of Evil Dead 2 when he's by himself, the only sane response is either to go completely crazy or become an action hero. Like when he's just by himself and he like tries to sit down in the chair and just collapses beneath him. First and foremost, it's like one of the funniest bits in the whole movie. But then, of course, like, the deer head looks at him, starts laughing. Then he starts laughing. He's like looking at the lamp and he's laughing and he's just losing his fucking mind. He looks right into the camera and it's like, ah! It's maybe the craziest close-up of that entire decade of him looking into the camera and just losing his fucking mind.
Well, I would argue and have argued that his performance in Evil Dead 2 is one of the great performances in cinema history.
I have no problem with that.
And that
I have no problem with that.
And that very few people, if any, could have pulled off what he pulls off in that movie, considering that he carries a big chunk of that movie
solo performance,
completely by himself. It's really astounding. And sometimes you just have to sit back and and be in awe of like a performer. And I really think that nobody could have done it the way with the amount of success that he does.
Well, it's a weird thing where Sam Raimi loves to torture and abuse his actors in a loving way because he only tortures and abuses people that he likes. But to have an actor who's that physically resourceful, who's that charming, who's that funny, who's that strong, who can do most of what Sam Raimi wants from a performer. Because Sam Raimi is always going to ask the impossible and hope he gets like halfway there. But just little things like when you have like the blood pouring out of the wall and then like it goes back in, how they shot it in reverse and how they designed the whole room sideways so he could basically lie on a board and have like 55 gallons of blood like just dropped onto his face. And they're like, well, he's like, what happens if I start to drown? Like, well, flail your arms around. He's like, well, aren't I supposed to be flailing my arms around anyway? And they're like, well, how much blood is there? Like, oh, let's just shoot it. And now he had like blood coming out of his nose for weeks because he just sat there and just inhaled 55 gallons of blood just being dropped on his fucking face. Most actors today, like when you see in the news people talking about like, Tarantino like spitting on his actresses or choking his actresses on the set of Kill Bill, it's like, go work on a Sam Raimi movie. It's going to be a hell of a lot worse than being fucking spat on and choked and that sort of thing. You're going to suffer that like by 9 a.m.
But I was watching an interview with Eli Roth, and he was talking about how before they made Cabin Fever, which I think is his first feature, which is not really a ripoff of Evil Dead, but obviously
clearly it made in the same spirit.
Yeah. He sat and showed all the actors Evil Dead, and they talked about Evil Dead, and then every time the actors would start to get difficult with the working conditions, he would just be like, Evil Dead guys, like you think you got a bed, and then everybody would shut up. Like think about Bruce Campbell.
Like Bruce Campbell talks about how like one night he twisted the fucking shit out of his ankle and he couldn't put his weight on it. And of course, like on most movie sets, if that were to happen, like you'd shut the movie down for a week and you would put them on a bed of pillows and you'd like feed them grapes and you would like nurse them back to health. He says basically that like the crew, they all picked up sticks and started poking him in his foot and poking his ankle. Like, does that hurt? Does that hurt? How much does this hurt? They just started like just fucking with them. Now people like you go on Twitter like, he was mean to me. It's like, yeah, this is a Sam Raimi production, and these guys, they were old friends, and because they're old friends, they could cross a lot of lines when it came to ethical conduct on the set. All right, well, I feel like we have talked quite a bit about the making of Evil Dead, where it came from, and a little bit about the making of Evil Dead 2, but I don't feel like we've really talked about like the story, like the narrative that much yet, because I feel like maybe at this point when people are like hardcore fans, like the narrative is so obvious and has so much appeal to them that it almost kind of becomes immaterial and there's more about like the phenomenon. But this is probably the first time as a teenager where I was aware that I was part of what was becoming a legitimate cult phenomenon. But what is it about this story in particular that makes people so drawn to it across multiple generations? Because it's a weird thing where it's like, yeah, you have one like legit hardcore supernatural horror movie, one deranged like Three Stooges style like slapstick comedy horror, and then you have this strange fantasy adventure story that also incorporates like 80s one-liners like give me some sugar baby and that sort of stuff. And it's like, it shouldn't be a cult classic, but it is somehow, like almost like in spite of itself. But like, I love all three movies in their own right, and I love the story of Ash, But I guess maybe it was just you as a consumer, like what makes this particular story, like all the filmmaking aside, like all the legend and myth making about these creators, what is it about the story that just, because if the story doesn't draw you in, then everything else is immaterial.
It's an interesting question because I'm not sure there's anything about the story. I think, look, anything on paper, if we were to sit here and I was to describe to you the plot of Evil Dead, there's nothing about it that's not cliche. It's all about execution. And in anybody else's hands, it probably would not work. But there's something about catching lightning in a bottle and kind of the vision that Sam Raimi had at such a young age. And in terms of the other films, I think it's that, and I think it's Bruce Campbell. Like, I think it's one of the rare occasions where I'm not sure the story really has anything to do with it. In a lot of ways, like, to not to go back to it, but Dario Argento, like, what's going on in a Dario Argento movie plot-wise and dramatically is not significant most of the time. It's how he does it is what works, and it's why I think he's very polarizing. Dario Argento is that, like, it either speaks to you on some kind of visceral level and you connect with it, or it doesn't. I agree that Evil Dead is great because in the midst of Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Black Christmas, Halloween,
Hills Have Eyes, which shows up in Evil Dead.
Hills Have Eyes, we get like this supernatural take on kind of this convention. But at the same time, we're coming out of the mid-'70s, which is the era of like The Exorcist and The Omen.
True.
But I guess in terms of low-budget horror movies, and it's also...
But I think of any budget, they're still the best demons ever caught on film. The way they laugh and the way they talk. Something about the image of this fucking chick, Cheryl, down in the basement, shoving on the damn doorway to the cellar in a futile way, but also kind of mocking and laughing, like just imitating the people up above. It gives me the goddamn heebie-jeebies when she's having the time of her life, locked in the cellar, just cracking up at these poor, pathetic humans who are.
It's incredibly creepy. I mean, everything about it. But it has to do with like that low budgetness.
Is that cellar door there in the original house? I know the original house burned down in 1980, but I know like the cellar itself is the Rob Tapper family.
No, I think
family
they
home.
They cut the door into the floor.
Gotcha, and they just knew they were going to fake it when they got back.
I think so. Yeah.
Interesting. Because I know they spent like a week like raising the ceiling and like kind of like changing the interior of the house because the house had like 6 inches of cow shit, first and foremost, throughout all of it when they first got there.
Yeah.
And the house it had no telephone line, had no running water, had no electricity, and they had to get it basically movie ready when they first moved in there.
I think they just cut the door into the floor of the cabin. I don't think there was a cellar.
Yeah, because it's just dirt. I mean, I think when you look at the cabin, you're like, oh, this is like a 2-room cabin. There's no basement in that fucking cabin.
Yeah, it's just dirt because there's also all those effects where you have like them dismembered. And they're like basically sitting, I think, on the ground underneath the house with their head sticking out through the floor. But I think what people there's that I was some interview that I was reading or watching. Somebody referred to the fact that, in their opinion, if the effects in the first Evil Dead were if they had the money and the capability to do the effects in The Exorcist, Exorcist quality effects in Evil Dead, that Evil Dead would be way more of like a colossal success. And I don't necessarily agree with that. There's something about
the demons get worse as the movies go on. Like the budgets get bigger. Evil Dead 2 and Army of Darkness, it's almost like Sam Raimi accidentally made them scared because what he really wanted to do was something quite different. They're more comedic in number 2 and number 3. It's like he accidentally stumbled blindly into making the most terrifying fucking demons I've ever seen.
They're so creepy, and like they're spitting up like black and milk. It's like there's something about like the primitive nature of the effects that are just so unsettling.
And the fake shimps somehow make it weird. Like I mean, people don't know what a fake shimp is. Basically, there's a couple Three Stooges shorts where they had a fake shimp, where where basically you could tell it's a double. It's not shimp, but they just thought that was hysterical. And so but as actors and crew members started to quit the production because they were suffering miserably, and people had school and jobs and all these other commitments, they would have certain crew members, oftentimes Rob Tappert, fill in for like actresses who had left. And so when you're watching them, you're like, oh, that monster looks totally different from how they looked like in the previous scenes because they were fake shimping it. But somehow that, like, in my imagination as a kid, I was like, oh, the demons are changing and evolving as they take damage. Like, it never even occurred to me there's, like, 6 different actors playing, in some cases, like, the same character.
Yeah, and, sometimes, like, legs walking by the screen are Ted Raimi, who was, like, a 16.
Yeah, he's a child. But when you
like
see
that.
Ted Raimi popping up in the second season of Ash vs. Evil Dead, there's like this incredible rapport and sense of shared history. Like when he and Bruce Campbell are reminiscing about like the booze they used to serve at parties and things like that. Like it's fucking real. Like these guys have known each other now for a century. And when the actress who plays Cheryl shows up in season 2 and still looks just like Cheryl in the first, I was like, wait a second. She's like almost 60 years old, but her hair, she looks identical to how she did back then. Like it imbues the whole franchise with so much more like depth and like pathos, and it just it makes me smile inside when I see these people still showing up decades later.
Yeah. So it's tough to know why, but I do think, like I said, I think less than story, its execution is what works about it. And sometimes that's enough, especially for a genre picture.
I think we as the viewer, we project things onto it. Like when I watched Evil Dead 1 as a kid, when he puts his hand into the mirror and it goes in and into water and he pulls his hand out and he like screams in horror. As a teenager, I was like, oh, that's foreshadowing for Evil Dead 2 because his hand's going to get infected and he's going to have to lop it off. They weren't thinking about that at all when they shot that. It just looked cool.
Yeah.
But I think as a viewer, if you like something, you bring your own baggage and your own interpretation to the table, and you give it depth that may or may not be there. Like the same way, like Bruce Campbell has a logical explanation as to why the first 10 minutes of Evil Dead 2 seems so familiar, but I projected onto it. Oh, no. It's I'm supposed to take it straight, and I think it makes the movies perhaps better than the filmmakers even intended initially.
Yeah, I also find it interesting that 2 things. That one, we all view Ash, and now it's just even more solidified with the television show, but as like this pompous, like arrogant idiot. Who
like smokes weed with hookers and reads from the Necronomicon and gets the whole thing started all up again. Like,
but even before the show, that was kind of the view of Ash, and when I was interviewing Joe LaDuca, he was talking about how probably a mistake on his part is the piano piece that Ash plays at the beginning
of Evil Dead 2.
That it's too complicated, and that like Ash would never be able to play something that. And I joked around. I was like, well, there's always. I could totally see Ash learning how to play one piece of music to impress a girl.
Yeah, absolutely.
But it's funny because the view of what we have of Ash is really Army of Darkness.
And like the last like 10 minutes of Evil Dead 2.
Yeah. It's like I find it interesting that it's like we ignore the fact that he's not like that through the majority of the series. And we just accept. And then I also
some people shit on Army of Darkness, but they forget what an impact Army of Darkness had on defining the character. Because like now the only version of Ash we think of is the Army of Darkness hero. But he was not the hero for a very long time.
And in a lot of ways, I feel almost bad because Campbell was so good at that it became like his persona, and he's gotten typecast as that ever since. I mean, he's actually a really good actor, and he doesn't, unfortunately, get a chance to do things
like Andrew Dice Clay and the Dice Man. The Dice Man used to be a character he played on stage. He had like a couple different characters he would do on stage, and the Dice Man, he would like put on the jacket, put on the shades, and he would become the Dice Man. But he became a victim of his own success, and now Andrew Dice Clay no longer exists. He just stays in character as the Dice Man all day, every day.
He became the character.
He became the character in a lot of ways.
I think unfortunately we all view everybody. Campbell was so good at being Ash in Army of Darkness that he's that in almost everything now. Whereas if you look right around that time, in the late '90s, early 2000s, he did an episode of X-Files, and he is genuinely good in it. And it has nothing to do with Army of Darkness. His performance has nothing to do with
good.
that.
Hudsucker Proxy. It's not a very well-known or well-loved Coen Brothers movie, but he's one of Jennifer Jason Leigh's kind of like collaborators at the newspaper, and he's good. He's doing like a Howard Hawks movie.
Yeah, he's generally good, but unfortunately, like he's now that pompous, and he plays it now on stage. At the conventions, like he plays
because the fans want it.
Yeah,
the fans want the larger-than-life persona.
When you look at his book and you look at like the pictures of them, or you read his book, you realize that he was really just like this geek, but he's now risen to become.
We didn't even start packing on muscle until Evil Dead 2. Like basically, he was working out 2 hours a day for weeks leading up to it, just trying to get lean and strong. But he was kind of a flabby guy before that,
and he wasn't even playing that kind of character in Briscoe County, which was before Army of Darkness. So I just find that interesting. But equally as interesting that like.
Well, Army of Darkness came out in 1992. I thought Briscoe was like 94, 95 or something like that.
Yeah, maybe, but I guess it just didn't. It didn't find its audience.
It didn't find you until after.
Well, I mean, I don't think
because Army of Darkness. I remember
it wasn't successful at the box office.
That is certainly true. Yeah,
and it was delayed. They shot it like 2 years before. It was delayed because it was produced by Dino De Laurentiis, but Dino De Laurentiis sued Universal because they did Silence of the Lambs, and Dino thought he owned the rights to Hannibal Lecter because he did Manhunter.
Yeah,
and so unfortunately,
which is why he returned to the franchise for Hannibal years later.
Which is unfortunate because it meant that Army of Darkness then sat in waiting for like a year or two before it ended up getting released, and then Universal ended up ravaging that movie, cutting it way down to like a cool 80 minutes and changing the ending.
The new beginning and the new ending, I kind of like the scenes. And also, as Bruce Campbell says, Bridget Fonda was a big fan of 1 and 2, and she wanted to be in the movie. So they gave her a non-speaking role where she gets to scream. But Bridget Fonda, boom, suddenly in the beginning of Army of Darkness.
Bridget Fonda seems awesome.
Yeah.
Because she's in Army of Darkness because she was a fan of the first 2 movies. There's some documentary that has to do with.
She's in like single white female mode, like that short hair, and I was like, oh my God, you're hot.
But she's a huge fan of Suspiria. Apparently, there's some documentary, something about Argento or Suspiria, where they're interviewing the director of photography. And the director of photography of Suspiria is the guy that shot Single White Female. Gotcha. And it's the scene where she's tied up and like has the tape over her mouth. She's gagged or whatever. And the director of photography started talking about Suspiria. And she's like, started like fussing. So they went and they removed the tape. She's like, why are you guys talking about Suspiria? And the director's like, because he shot Suspiria. She's like, you shot Suspiria? So Bridget Fonda seems like probably the most awesome woman of all time.
Well, I was already a fan. I mean, I've been a fan basically my whole life because I guess I think I saw Single White Female in the theater, which is probably my first exposure. Or what was that movie where it's like a bunch of girls like going to Fort Lauderdale for the weekend? It was like the Shag. It's a late. You're an '80s guy. What is that movie?
Yeah.
It's a chick flick from the late '80s, and she's in it, and Phoebe Cates, and a couple other actresses.
Sounds amazing.
It's The Shag. I think, but it was my sisters loved it. So I think that was my first exposure.
She was in that. I think the first time I noticed her was she was in that American remake of La Femme Nikita.
Yeah, I saw that in the theater. Point of No Return, baby.
Point of No Return.
Yeah, I was in high school when that bad boy came out. Yeah, oh my God, she was so damn cute back then. In any case, so yeah, getting back to these flicks, I just was glancing at my notes and I forgot there's like two essential anecdotes from the shooting of Evil Dead. And this is not meant to make fun of the South because I'm from the South. I love and adore the South. But these were Northern boys who were getting their first exposure to the South, and they were learning to say yes, sir, and no, ma'am, and all that stuff. And he talks at length in his book about being exposed to Southern hospitality and having a Southern Thanksgiving and how there were like 6 different forms of sweet potatoes. And he was like, what the fuck's going on? Like, it just blew his mind that like total strangers would invite like 18 knuckleheads into their home to have this enormous feast. But when he went to the bank to get money out, and he knows that the money had a funny smell, and he was informed that some of the people around there were a little suspicious of banks, and they were prone to bury their money in the dirt. So a lot of the money would smell like soil. But that their location manager, they kept begging and pleading for him to get him some moonshine. He's like, fine, it's not for kids. And they're like, we can take over from the north. So they drank this moonshine, and Bruce Campbell says, it didn't make you drunk. That was way too powerful for that. It just made you crazy. So they went to the nightclub, the local nightclub, which is a small, claustrophobic little room, and they saw some girls huddled up on the other end of the room. And Bruce walked over and was like, you ever danced with a Northern boy before? And they were like, I don't know. And so they started dancing. He said, like, he would fall down, she would pick him up, she would fall down, he'd pick her up. And like halfway the dance, he's like, you smell so unusual. What is that like beautiful fragrance you're wearing? She said, ivory soap. So like they at least were having like some fun on the side when they weren't freezing their ass off and covered in Caro syrup or Cairo syrup, as they say in Tennessee, and just like the shit they went through while making that. At least it seems like on Evil Dead 2, they're shooting in North Carolina and a little bit more money to work with, and but still Bruce was having to do things like what's the name of that rig that they came up with that they attached him to for this shot where he's going through the trees, spinning in all directions? It has the rig has a very specific name. It's called the Samocam, and you're basically lashed to an X. But that scene, that's the moment where I don't know if you've ever taken hallucinogenics, but when we were watching it, you have no attention span. You can't focus on anything but in the moment. But when that scene came up and he started going through the woods and spinning around and going through the trees, I mean, if somebody had died from laughter, it would have come as no surprise. But that scene, for whatever reason, has always had this wild impact on me because of that one moment.
And they shot it for an entire day's worth of shooting doing that.
And apparently he's puking his guts out. Like one of the guys working on like the rig down below was like, "What'd you have for breakfast?" And he was like, "I don't know." He's like, "Why do you ask?" Like, "Because I'm about to see it like real soon."
Because they were shooting it at like 2 frames a second or something like that, so they were going really slow, and they would just and Sam had control of how it would spin. It would spin,
the last person you want to have
clockwise and counterclockwise, and so he would just get tossed around, spun around, and they would just have people run by him, slapping him with
branches
and leaves and stuff. And then they did it for an entire day.
Well, you as an editor and as somebody who's pretty familiar with post-production, how would you characterize the use of sound in Evil Dead 2 during scenes that are not necessarily played at their normal speed, but he almost, I think, accidentally at times makes some of the funniest sound gags in history. Like when he's fighting his hand and he suddenly says, "work shed." And you could tell they recorded it after the fact because everything's all sped up. Like, what's the technical terminology for him describing that strange sound? Or when he's hitting himself in the stomach going, and like throwing himself over.
Yeah.
But it makes me shit myself with laughter every time I fucking see it.
I would imagine it would just be ADR, but I'm sure knowing them, they might have just recorded them separate, which might be why it sounds kind of off.
Yeah, very off.
Campbell tells a funny story when he was working on Escape from LA. When he met Kurt Russell for the first time, Kurt Russell came on. He's like, "Hey Bruce, say work shit."
Yeah. And it's like good-natured ribbing because but it's technical. It's like it seems like it's sloppy, but it's also incredible because when you watch the movie and you love the movie, when he says work shed, it was added after the fact, but it makes you fucking laugh, and it's just Evil Dead 2 is one of the funniest movies of that entire fucking decade. Yeah,
I mean, I think. Look, a movie like Evil Dead 2 lends itself to that. I mean, it's hyper realistic. I think what's interesting about the Evil Dead series is I think as the series goes on, you get closer to probably what Raimi wanted to actually do. Because like we said, they were comedy fans. They weren't really horror fans. So the second film comes around and it's kind of half horror, half comedy, and then the third one they're like
smashing plates on his head and everything. And the smashing the plates on his head, it's like fucking you're like in like I don't know like Charlie Chaplin mode at that point. I mean, it's incredible what Bruce Campbell was doing.
Yeah, it's an amazing physical performance. I mean, it's like I said, it's part of the whole thing I was saying. It's like I feel like his performance in Evil Dead 2 is one of the great cinematic performances.
The one-liners are so damn funny as well. Like when the head is in the vice and she's like, "Your Susan burns in hell, she suffers," and he says, "You're going down." It's like, whoa, Ashton did a one-liner, but then the one-liners start coming more and more as the movie goes, and by the time you get to Army of Darkness, it's nothing but one-liners, quip, quip, quip.
Yeah, well, it's funny because the second film is a lot about Ash rising to the occasion, becoming the hero. Like you said, he's not really the hero of the first one; he's the survivor.
Yeah.
but he's not really the hero. The second one is more of like that hero's journey of like him having to step up to the plate, him having to, and we have the patented Sam Raimi montage where they build the the chainsaw hand, and then when it's done he says groovy, and now he's now a hero.
I've been using groovy ever since seeing these movies, and is there anything more American than a chainsaw and a shotgun? The fact they've like combined a chainsaw, like if you think about like the conquering of the American West was done with like a shotgun and a chainsaw, and like the fact that he's got both, it just makes him like this quintessential like American figure in a lot of ways.
And then when we get to the third movie, it's like he regresses and becomes a complete buffoon, but then has to rise to the occasion again. It's a very odd, if you look at that as
they're trying to make him remember the expression, and he's like, I got your damn words.
Yeah, maybe I didn't say every little syllable, but I
He
said
gets so
them.
irritated. They repeat it to him twice. Like, all right, again. He's like, all right, I got it.
I've probably watched Army of Darkness more times than I've watched any other movie.
No, I just noticed for the first time ever when I was watching it this time a couple of days ago that in the credits in the crew you have fake shimps. Like they don't call them like crew or stunt people or anything like that. They have like over 20 people listed as fake shimps in the credits.
When Army of Darkness is one of those movies, everybody, especially film lovers, they all have movies that you can watch anytime. If it's on TV, you can sit and watch it, even if you watched it yesterday. Now, back in the day, before we all listened to music on our phones, maybe the original iPod had just come out. I had this big MP3 player that had like a really big screen, like I don't know, like a fucking 4x6. So it was big. It was like before tablets, but it was this big MP3 player, and I bought it because you could watch movies on it. It wasn't just an MP3; it was like a full media player, and it was pretty big. And I would, I would switch out the movies on it because I would travel. I had a lot of commuting to do in those days, and it was all public. It was all public travel, so it was all like buses and trains. So I would travel 5 hours a day round trip. So 2.5 hours in the morning, 2.5 hours at night. And so I just needed stuff to pass that time. But the one movie that was always on, and to this day, it's on my Kindle, whatever, I always have Army of Darkness on because I know like no matter what, if I'm sitting around and I have time to kill anywhere, I will always be in the mood to watch Army of Darkness.
So when you hear some people shitting on it, and I'm not one of those people, I've watched it many times with a big giant smile on face. I think first weekend I rented it, I think I watched it like 4 times that first weekend and like laughed uproariously each time. But how do you kind of make the pitch for Army of Darkness for people to think, well, it's not as good as Evil Dead 2 or it's so different from Evil Dead 2 that they get kind of frustrated by it?
Okay, you're not going to convince anybody.
Yeah, for me it's like a Ray Harryhausen movie. Like Ray Harryhausen and the Three Stooges got together and made a movie.
It's exactly, and Campbell is so great in it.
He's like, well, hello, Mr. Fancy Pants. Like
when I was, preparing for the Joe LaDuca interview for the upcoming podcast, and then doing some editing, and I was, listening to the tracks, like I know that movie so well that like I could do the dialogue to the music. I was like, oh, this is where like, and I thought, it's so. It's just the one-liners are so great. He's so great.
You're in charge of 2 things right now: Jack and shit. And Jack left town. Like,
are all men from the future loudmouth bags? No, just me, baby.
Yeah.
Just me.
So damn solid. Yeah, I mean the swagger he enjoys in it. I think, like you said, it's the ultimate hero's journey, and like the fact that you have. I remember the first time I saw fragments of Evil Dead 2, watching it with my dad, and my dad just could not get like what was going on with Evil Dead 2. The first time he heard him say groovy with like the chainsaw, he was like, what? It kept like throwing him out of the movie. And the ending where he shows up in the Middle Ages, never is like, Sam Raimi has that great cameo where he's like throwing out some pretty bland, generic medieval phrasing about, hey, the hero from the sky who comes to deliver us from the Deadites, or whatever he says. But like, I was like, this is deliriously insane and weird, but I kind of love it. I could tell my dad wasn't into it, but the fact that they would like stick with that and carry it over into the next movie, it just they're slowly but surely like building this mythology and this lore, and the fact that like the show now still continues to build, and it's not just like pillaging that lore, it's adding to it and contributing to it and fleshing it out, and they're creating this like giant fantasy horror comedy saga that kind of stands alone.
I think part of what the problem is, obviously not for Evil Dead fans, not for Sam Raimi fans, but for the people that aren't. I think part of the problem with Sam Raimi is people don't get it. Don't get like that things are tongue in cheek or that they're supposed to be funny. Like Darkman, for instance.
Yeah.
If you just kind of saw Darkman, like I did at the movies, not really knowing,
It's like a straight superhero movie.
yeah, and it's not. It's hyper realistic. Like that's Raimi's style in so many things. Quick and the Dead. Like it's not a serious Western.
Yeah, people always forget that Quick and Dead even exists. But yeah, young Leonardo DiCaprio and Gene Hackman and Sharon Stone, Russell Crowe.
Like my podcasting partner Dion doesn't like it because to him it's just like too much of this like blatant ripping off of Leone's style. It's like, no, it's not ripping off. It's, you know, it's taking it to the next level. It's like he so exaggerates it that it becomes ridiculous. You know, it's something about obviously Raimi had like a bit of a changing point when he got to like Simple Plan and stuff, where he started to take things a little more seriously. But especially there's a whole bunch of his work that I think the problem is people just don't know what to make of it. And I think one could really have a, specifically with Evil Dead 2, like not understand what's happening. I think
like when the eyeball flies across the room and lands in the girl's mouth. I remember my dad was like, "What the hell?" And I was like, "That's hilarious." And I remember like after seeing that, because I wasn't quite sure what the movie was, but when I got back, my dad lived in Virginia, and I was living in North Carolina at the time. When I got back home like a few days later, I remember talking with my babysitter Ramona, who I've mentioned a few times on the podcast. But she was like, "I saw this weird movie over the weekend, and there's this guy, he just wouldn't die." Like that was her way, and I was like, "I know." I was like, "I saw it," because we were just thinking like, when he gets kicked and he like falls down the stairs like kind of like upside down, or when he gets like pulled through the cellar stairs and things like that, like it suddenly at some point like halfway through the movie, Ash becomes completely totally indestructible in ways that are just delicious to behold.
it's that Three Stooges thing.
Yeah.
You know, it's that crazy slapstick comedy or the like Roadrunner, Wile E. Coyote stuff. It's
They shot it like the part when he gets pulled through the stairs by Henrietta, like they shot it in reverse. So when you see it played the right way, it just looks fucking bizarre because it's clearly him just crawling out through the hole. But it actually kind of works. It has this weird Sam Raimi energy, and like whenever you see a Sam Raimi movie from the 21st century, there's always little sequences like, that's the Sam Raimi I know and love. Like remember when Spider-Man 2 came out, everybody was talking about the scene where Doc Ock, like his arms wake up and start attacking all the doctors, because it felt like a scene from Evil Dead 2 or Army of Darkness. Like, that's the most Sam Raimi-esque sequence from the whole movie. Like, he still got it. He still knows how to do those scenes when he wishes to.
Yeah, and that's why, like, Drag Me to Hell was, like, such a weird breath of fresh air.
Yeah, because it was a return to form, yeah.
He brought back the cinematographer from Evil Dead 2.
Yeah, no one wants to see The Wizard of Oz or whatever that fucking movie is called.
I actually really like that movie.
I didn't even see it, yeah.
I saw it at the movies, and I think it's one of those instances where, like, I needed that movie at that time. You know, it's not great, but, like,
What's it called? Oz the Great and Powerful? Is that what it's called?
I think so, yeah.
Oz the Great.
It was like it was total escape, and I needed it at that moment. Drag Me to Hell, you know, I love it, and it's one of my favorite scores. I love Chris Young's score.
It works.
For
It
that
has
movie.
legit scares, legit creativity. It's exciting. It's fun. It's creative.
Musically, the Evil Dead series is interesting because like it doesn't have any kind of continuity, even though it's all done by Joe LaDuca. The first one, he wrote obviously for budgetary reasons. He wrote for a string quintet, which is and he also uses a synthesizer. I
love the music in the first Evil Dead. When the fucking cellar door opens on its own and that organ music plays.
Yeah.
I feel like ghosts are tap dancing on my grave every time I see that scene.
The second film, he's using an orchestra, but he doesn't really go back to any of the establishing themes. Not even like that kind of love theme from the first one, which is very kind of schmaltzy, but kind of perfect in that movie. And then the third one, obviously, is a whole different thing. So he's got this huge orchestra and a choir. Danny Elfman wrote the March of the Dead track, and I asked Joe why that was, and apparently, I think it was that Danny Elfman had just done Darkman.
Gotcha.
And Raimi wanted the piece of music for like on set. To play. So before they even had a composer signed on for Army of Darkness, Elfman wrote this piece of music for it, and so that's why it's the one piece of music that Joe LaDuca didn't write. But it's interesting because there's a couple of series like that. Friday the 13th, not Friday, Nightmare on Elm Street is kind of like that in that no composer did more than one. And there's a large chunk of them that don't even use Charles Bernstein's themes.
And speaking of which, that was actually the very first time I saw a scene from Evil Dead, even though I didn't know it was Evil Dead, was Nightmare on Elm Street 1, where it's playing on TV.
Yeah,
it's that great bit where
it.
the camera zooms, like, goes down the hall, and, like, you hear, like, the clock, like, the toll its bell, and, like, he turns his head around. But that's yet another, like, great, like, Raimi flourish, which is, like, crazy movements, crazy sounds, but really nothing's happening, but you can't take your eyes off it. But it's just this great sequence. Everybody in the cast at that point is either dead or a deadite or whatever, and so it becomes just this one-man show at the end of the movie.
I think obviously visual style is kind of one of Raimi's strengths, and the other is pacing, and that has to do with like the editing of things. Like it
helps when you got Joel Cohen as the assistant editor on Evil Dead.
Yeah, what's interesting. Yeah,
he did the workshed sequence in the first movie.
He so I was reading something on. Maybe it was Wikipedia, and they were saying that it was edited in Michigan, but they went to New York to edit it.
They were traveling back and forth, yeah.
And Joel Cohen was the assistant editor on the film, and that's how they met. And then he ended up writing Crime Wave with Joel and Ethan Cohen.
And the fake trailer for Blood Simple that was used by the Coens to raise money stars Bruce Campbell because they were all becoming friends and collaborators.
And was inspired by the fact that they had done Within the Woods. And in Blood Simple, they used the shaky cam.
Gotcha.
So there's a lot of crossover, and then you were just talking about Hudsucker Proxy. Raimi wrote that with the Coen brothers.
Dude, I love Raimi's cameo in Miller's Crossing when they're raiding that like warehouse, and somebody comes out like to give up, and Sam Raimi just blows him away. And he kind of smirks and laughs at the other corrupt cops. And then suddenly someone like opens up a Gatling gun, like, and Raimi like starts going, pow, pow. He doesn't like run for cover. He whips out, he just starts like two-gunning it. And right back, of course, he gets blown away. But Sam Raimi, when he hands it up for the camera, he's actually pretty goddamn good.
Yeah. They have an interesting history. And really, unfortunately, like Evil Dead 2, like, never would have gotten made had Crime Wave not been such a miserable failure.
Yeah. Well, they had a lot too much interference, and they wanted to be left alone. And basically everything that had made Evil Dead a success was second guessed or kind of like done against their will on their second feature. So with Evil Dead 2, they basically went near Charlotte, North Carolina. They went out about an hour and a half out into the woods, and they realized like nobody's going to come out here and fuck with us. We'll, for the most part, be left alone.
Yeah, I mean, look. Without studio interference, like Campbell would have been the lead, and so maybe that would have changed things. I mean, it's a fucking batshit crazy movie, Crime Wave, and part of it is that like Raimi just wanted to do everything, and it's this wacky comedy, crime story, homage to film noir, wacky. It is fucking wacky. It's like really the best way to describe that movie. So who knows if it as a movie, maybe it would have been better, but would it have been a financial success? I don't know. But so because Raimi was always very reluctant to do Evil Dead 2, never really wanted to do it. But then when Crime Wave failed so poorly financially, and it was such a bad experience, they basically him and Tappert were like, we have to do a movie that one will work, and two, we can make money at. So then they decided that maybe they should do Evil Dead 2. Now, what's interesting is the original...
Didn't Stephen King vouch for them with Dino De Laurentiis? So Dino De Laurentiis was making something at the time where somebody basically said, look, like, you need to work with these guys. Like, I can't remember the exact story.
King. That was in the 80s when King had a deal with De Laurentiis, and De Laurentiis had done Silver Bullet. I think he was producing Maximum Overdrive.
That was it,
at the time. And so there was this word on the street that the guys wanted to do Evil Dead 2, and it was Stephen King said to De Laurentiis, you should do it. And I think, this could be hearsay, but I think that De Laurentiis met with them and offered Raimi Thinner.
Interesting.
And Raimi turned it down.
Which is a Bachman book, but became eventually known as a Stephen King book.
I think it was King that, he was
When was King outed as Richard Bachman? Like 85, 86?
Oh, that I don't know. I know we talked a bit about it when we did Romero because of the Dark Half.
And in the intro to Dark Half, he talks about it as well. But because Dark Half springs forth from that whole experience. All right, quick question in terms of like lore of Evil Dead. This is something I've always wondered, always been confused by. And I kind of almost don't even want to know the answer to it because it might ruin some of the mystery. But in Evil Dead 2, one of the strangest parts of the whole movie is right before the archaeologist's daughter utters the final word of the phrasing. On the monster that's come through, you have these little faces on the monster go like, we've won, and this other face goes, victory is ours! And I've always wondered, like, who the fuck are those people? And what is going on? Like, are these, like, are they like demons that are announcing their victory, but they're like, I mean, I don't want to say anything. What is your take on that?
Honestly, I've never thought about it. You know, it could be, you know, it could be like the concept for John Carpenter's The Thing was like the thing could imitate anything it's ever been.
Gotcha.
So maybe it's like all the victims from centuries past are absorbed into it. Who knows? It's a good question. I never really put that much thought into it.
Because now in the show, they do a pretty good job of having the lore make narrative sense. And one of the brilliant things about the show is that they acknowledge Evil Dead 1 and 2. Like there are clips, they show flashbacks from both movies. It's not like they just view Evil Dead 2 as like the fresh start. They realize that people love all three movies, so they need to show clips and reference events from all three. So they basically treat 1 and 2 as both as canon, even if there's a logical explanation as to why they kind of overlap in a weird way.
And I think it was originally they couldn't talk about 3 because of Universal Pictures, but I think
they made a reference to him visiting the Middle Ages. They made a reference. They didn't show a scene though.
They do in the second season, I think.
Yeah, he says, one time I went back to the Middle Ages. He just talks about it so casually.
You know, I think what's interesting, and I didn't even, I probably knew this at some point, but that Raimi's original, what he wanted to do with Evil Dead 2 was Army of Darkness.
Interesting.
He wanted it to be like that Campbell gets thrown through a portal and he ends up in the Middle Ages, but they couldn't do it for budgetary reasons. And so when they had a chance to do another one, they then revisited that idea, which it's just, I don't know.
So what do you think of the show? Because the thing that I like about the show is that they managed somehow to make me really happy while at the same time doing something new. Like Ash is part of a team now. Like the fact that they as a little trio have become such close friends, such great companions. I mean, like maybe my favorite scene out of both seasons so far is after they think Pablo has died, and the next episode starts with Bruce wasted in his car, sobbing uncontrollably with Pablo in pieces beside him. He's like, I don't miss my little Mexican buddy. I mean, my Mexican Honduran. But he is overwhelmed with grief and emotion because he misses his friend. And it's like, one thing you mentioned, Bruce Campbell having range, like it's something we haven't seen from Ash before, just complete grief and genuine grief. And it moved me and made me crack up like all at once.
You know, it's I mean, I like the show. I mean, I think the biggest complaint for me, and I think it's probably the biggest complaint for everybody, is that it's too short. I mean, they're half-hour episodes.
Yeah, 10 half-hour episodes, yeah.
You know, it's interesting because after they made the remake, the reboot or whatever in 2013.
Which had a really good trailer, but I was less impressed by the movie. The trailer actually kind of like scared me.
Yeah.
But the movie, I was like, I don't think I'll be revisiting this.
Yeah, when I saw it in the theater, I really liked it. I watched it again just to have a refresher on it for talking about the series today, just so in case they came up, I was a little more fresh on it. But when that came out, they started talking about, hey, maybe we should do another one of the original series, and that became like obviously it had always been talked about, but for some reason they started to take it more seriously.
And it's been 20 years at this point since they'd previously had an entry in
and
the
when
franchise.
when I interviewed Campbell, he was talking about how they probably were going to do it, but Raimi and Sam and Ivan Raimi were writing the script, and they, you know, just he was waiting till they had a script.
I'm fascinated by Ivan Raimi though. Here you have, he's I think a physician, like a legit physician. He's a doctor. Full-time doctor, grown man, like he was like, you know, the mature one of the Raimi family, and somehow he still like moonlights like as like a writer and producer. I outside of his medical profession. Like, you got Ivan, Sam, and Ted, and they're so different. And Ted, obviously, is an actor, and he's a very, very funny actor. I mean, he's got, I think, 4 parts in Army of Darkness.
Yeah.
And he was thrilled.
And he does a lot of voices.
And he's Henrietta in Evil Dead 2. And so, yeah. But
for me, and especially when Funderburg and I used to hang out, the most quoted line of all time for me, and still to this day, but Funderburg and I would say it every time we left anywhere, a restaurant, as we got up, one of us would go like, "Let's get the hell out of here."
Yeah.
It's the most used movie quote for me to this day. Every time I'm about to leave someplace, "Let's get the hell out of here." And that's Raimi. That's Ted Raimi.
Yeah.
Voicing the skeletons. The show, but what's interesting about the show is that it's really... So basically, they wanted to make a movie, and there was a couple of ideas. Some of them were kind of crazy, taking up where the original ending for Army of Darkness, which is like, I slept too long. Yeah. They were going to think about doing Ash versus the machines, Ash leading the machines against the Evil Dead, and then Raimi talks about how they had this one idea that was fucking batshit crazy, which was they were going to do a movie that took place in 2 parallel universes, where Ash... from both endings, where Ash was the hero in the S-Mart and also Ash in the future. So that one was, he's like, that one was getting a little too crazy. And then basically, I think it was Tappert was like, Tappert basically was the hands-on producer for the Hercules and Xena. And then,
he produced the Spider-Man movies as well, right?
I'm not sure.
I think he was involved. I know at some point he basically almost went into semi-retirement, but he's been a wildly successful producer.
But then he did like Spartacus series, and then Jack of All Trades with Campbell, and that like Cleopatra 20 whatever, when those were kind of back to back in syndication in the late 90s, early 2000s. And all that shit was shot in New Zealand, and he married Lucy Lawless, who I think is from New Zealand, and he was just like, what if we do it as a TV show? Like, this I know. Like, we could shoot it in New Zealand on the cheap.
Campbell's good at producing television as well.
And Campbell, had, by the time, since Army of Darkness, up until they made the movie, Campbell had become like a bona fide television star. He had Briscoe County. He had been on multiple episodes. He was on Burn Notice in a big or recurring part. So there was this like, Campbell's a TV star now. You produce television. So they decided to shop around the idea as a television show. And they had a couple of networks interested, but because they had done Spartacus on Starz, and they realized that they could have absolute creative control because it's a paid channel, so there's no restriction on content, they decided to go with Starz. Like you said, it's easy to be skeptical, but I was
downright cynical about it. I was like, I am never watching this ever. And then I watched the first episode directed by Sam Raimi. I was like, this is like really, really fucking funny. When it's like, he's screwing that girl in the bar at the very beginning. He's like, I'm getting a little winded. Why don't we focus on me a bit? I was just like, or he's like, he's putting on his girdle and looking at her like, yeah, looking good. Like,
well, it's also
he's
funny.
He's still Ash.
Because it's almost like, I don't know if you saw it, but Campbell directed a movie called My Name is Bruce.
I know, I never saw it, no.
Now, sadly, I saw that down at maybe the Sunshine Theater.
This is no longer there. Landmark Sunshine closed down.
Yeah, or some other theater. I saw it downtown somewhere, and I was literally the only person in the theater. But basically, it's Campbell playing Campbell, but it's like Campbell as Ash in Evil Dead.
If like Evil Dead actually
he
happened
lives in
to Bruce Campbell.
He lives in a trailer. I mean,
dude, when that scene when he and the hooker are stoned out of their mind, she's like, read me some poetry. He's like, I got some poetry for you, and he just whips up the Necronomicon, and they're like slowly reading the phonetic translation, like Kanda. I was like, this is genius. Of course, he's not even a middle-aged guy, like an old guy who's like still good with like money problems, like banging cheap hookers, who's just getting wasted in his like he's never grown up, he's never evolved past the guy we saw in Army of Darkness.
And I thought the most interesting for me as a fan and a viewer was watching the second episode and realizing that this is like the first time someone other than Sam Raimi has directed
an Evil Dead story.
An Evil Dead story with Ash and Bruce Campbell. And it was like, it's not It's someone trying to do Raimi, but
Yeah.
it's not quite Raimi.
Yeah, the episodes are uneven, but what I liked about that second episode is when you have like the little nod to the past, like when the way they shoot, the way he raises a cross above his head, kind of behind his head, and slams it down. It's like, my parents are Jewish. He's like, well, I wish you had told me that before I made all these crosses. She is so goddamn funny, and I can't remember if it was season 1 or season 2, but at one point they're like in a battle. He's like, you're like the daughter I never had, and she gives him a little wink. And their rapport, their chemistry is so cool because he's like raising the next generation of like Deadite slayers, and the fact that like they celebrate their victory of season 1 by just opening a bar in fucking Jacksonville, Florida. It's like their main goal in life is to like hang out in Jacksonville, Florida, and just get fucking wasted the rest of their lives. And he makes a joke about like, oh, I was about to stick my sausage into that mother-daughter sandwich. Like, it's got wildly irreverent lingo that I was just terrified that irreverent lingo would not be present in the show, and they just and instead they went the exact opposite. They lean into it.
Yeah, it's really funny. When I was Joe LaDuca does the music for it, who did the music for the original trilogy, and he was telling me that reason why some of the first season is so uneven is because basically Raimi used the vast majority of the budget for the entire season in the first episode.
Yeah, it's a good episode. It's a really good pilot.
It's funny on a personal level. I have an older brother, and he moved out to live with my dad. I don't know, when I was fairly young, and we'd see him on weekends, and then my mom remarried and we moved to Albany, and then I would only see him a couple times a year, and then he went to college and I didn't see him for like 4 years. But within the last 10 to 15 years, we've started to get closer again, and a lot of it's through talking about guitar and stuff like that. But a handful of years ago, we were driving, I guess I went to visit him, and we were driving back to his place from the train station, and he's like, you a fan of Bruce Campbell? And I was like,
thanks to my word.
I was like, he's fucking like my favorite actor of all time. I'm like, I've interviewed him, and he's like, yeah, my brother discovered Bruce Campbell through Bubba Hotep.
It's a funny as shit movie.
My brother is a big Elvis fan.
Gotcha.
So
he's a damn good Elvis. He was like, when Ozzy Davis is like, yeah, sometimes they suck your spirit out your asshole. He's like, where'd you read that? Hustler? Some of the way he says, where'd you read that? Hustler? It makes me fucking howl.
And so he became and then he was watching Bird Notice. He became this huge Bruce Campbell fan. So my brother's probably the first person to read, because I was like, oh, you got to read his book. And of course, this is before all that. This is before, the book ends before.
Bubba Hotep was like 02, 03 or something like that.
But the book ends before Bubba Hotep and Burn Notice. And I was like, oh, his book's really great. So my brother's probably the first person to read If Chins Could Kill before seeing the Evil Dead movies.
That's genuinely bizarre.
Because my brother's not a big horror fan, but then because he read those chapters, he wanted to watch them. So he got really into Evil Dead, so and specifically Bruce Campbell. So now Bruce Campbell is this thing that that we share, and he texted me just last week that he had jury duty, and for some reason the judge asked the potential jurors what their favorite television show was, and for some reason, which is very weird, my brother loved the show Chuck. Which was such a show that I wouldn't imagine that he would be into, but for some reason it's like his favorite show of all time. And so I said, did you say Chuck? He's like, no, it had to be a current show, and he said what show he said, and I didn't know what it was. And he said, but after we all answered, the judge said his favorite show was Ash versus Evil Dead.
That's awesome.
And my brother said, like, let's hear for Bruce Campbell, and he said the judge laughed, and nobody else knew what he was talking about. Look, it was a big deal. I think it delivers. It delivers. I mean,
it's Buffy the Vampire Slayer, but for like aging men, because it has the sensibility that we love about Bruce Campbell. But it basically it's kind of a Monster of the Week format in a lot of cases. It has an arc over the season, but every episode, whether they're fighting the car or fighting a demon or fighting whatever, there's a problem that will be solved and overcome just in time for a cliffhanger for the next episode. Yeah. So it's formulaic, it's episodic, but it makes me laugh. And the chemistry between the three leads is fantastic.
Well, what it does that the other three don't is that it takes Ash from Army of Darkness, like that character of Ash that we were just talking about, like developed what we think of Ash as being, and puts him in a horror movie, in a horror setting, because the third movie isn't. I mean, there's skeletons and there's demons, but it's adventure. It's a crazy adventure comedy. So what it ends up taking that Ash and putting him in Evil Dead 2.
Yeah,
kind of. So we get to see like that cocky, kind of idiotic Ash who just happens to be able to always rise to the occasion.
Yeah, like when he's sucking the evil juju out of his leg in the end of season 2. Like, I mean, I was like, this is like they're recreating Evil Dead 2 in a lot of ways, because he's like, his leg's about to get, he's like, I'm not chopping this off, and he starts like trying to suck the evil spirit out of his leg. I just started cackling like an idiot.
And you know, in that first episode when
when Pablo throws a chainsaw through
Pablo
the air,
kicks the
and
chainsaw.
he leaps through the air.
It's probably the greatest moment in all of television.
Yeah,
is when
he's fucking back.
The only thing I wish was different about that is that, to my recollection, it doesn't have that sound effect from Army of Darkness when the guy's like, "Oh, grade 1,"
yeah,
and he throws down and he goes thump.
Yeah, when he leaps up. Yeah.
And I wish like when his stump hits the thing, went thump. Just like it does in Armored Darkness, which to my recollection, it doesn't do.
Yeah, I can't remember. But that first, I mean, you want to talk about the way to, it's just like Star Wars is going through this right now. Like, obviously, all these like, attempts at like making old fucking franchises relevant in the present. And it's a really challenging thing to do, because do you embrace the old fans? Do you embrace the new fans? Do you try to straddle like that line? Like, how do you go about keeping a 40-year-old franchise relevant for new audiences? And I think by some miracle, Ash vs. Evil Dead pulled it off better than like Last Jedi. Like Last Jedi, which is very divisive, and it has angered a lot of fans. It has thrilled some fans, but it's like a political, I don't know, like it's like a really, really mean, nasty, vindictive debate online about whether or not Last Jedi is good or not. And I feel like Ash vs. Evil Dead is good enough that everybody's invited to the party.
You know, I think one of the things when I was in college, and maybe just out of college, and you know, at the height of maybe my Bruce Campbell obsession, I was planning on that Bruce Campbell was going to have this huge resurgence, because, you know, I've said it on a lot of other things and on my podcast and stuff, but I've also, there's, you know, Deanna and I have also talked about something that kind of contradicts it, but I do think that our generation and the generations immediately before ours.
And my generation's even a little older than yours.
Yeah, so it's like your generation and my generation and maybe the generation before you. It's just a couple years before you. We're nostalgic in a way that I don't think other previous generations were.
Maybe like in the 70s you had 50s nostalgia, like American Graffiti and stuff like that.
Yeah, like I said, but like at the same time, I've had plenty of discussions that contradicts that with like Happy Days and Grease.
We're nostalgic about genre entertainment in a way I think other generations are not, because we had Carpenter and we had Lucas and Spielberg and all these guys.
We're also nostalgic in a way in that like,
and we're territorial about it as well.
We're that, and we can collect things in a way because like we didn't get married when we were 18 and have a kid, and you know, we have disposable
we stayed
income.
children as opposed to like becoming 30 when we were 17.
But so like I had this big thing where it's like Campbell's going to become huge because everybody that grew up loving, you know, Army of Darkness and Evil Dead and Briscoe County are now in charge, and everybody's going to want to put him in something. And then it just never happened. Campbell's one of those actors where like it just like never really happened for him for some reason.
Yeah,
I mean, he
played the convention circuit, and he was like a cult figure, but it was always like a very small niche.
But he
market.
was a good look. He's a dreamboat back in his day, you know. And I remember watching like the special features for Briscoe County, and there's this girl that plays like his love interest in that show, and she talks about how she had like the way she talks about him, you could just tell that she was absolutely in love with him. And I was watching it with a friend of mine that was female, and I was like, man, you could tell she really loved it. She's like, well, how could she not? You know, like he was fucking
stud.
He was fucking dreamy. He was talented, but it just never really happened for him. And it's a weird thing, and like for instance, putting aside any recent controversy, there was always like in my head I was like, why isn't Quentin Tarantino putting Bruce Campbell in something? Like he's resurrecting fucking like Robert Forster and John Travolta.
Yeah, I think Tarantino, because he's
like
in his early 50s, he wasn't necessarily if he'd been a kid in the 80s, he probably would have been.
But there's
Bruce
no
Campbell
way
fan.
he doesn't love Evil Dead.
I don't know. But yeah, as far as that controversy recently, I thought it was so crazy. Like, something everyone overlooked about it is that the footage everyone found so controversial, he went to a warehouse he hadn't used in 15 years and dug up the footage to give to Uma Thurman. Everyone's like, oh my God, this footage is so damning and so condemning. It's like, he gave her the fucking footage as a favor. Like, he didn't have to dig that shit up. Like, everyone's acting like he was like trying to like keep it a secret. It's like he volunteered the fucking footage. So that is such a fake controversy.
But now, now Campbell's like an older guy, and he's got the show, and hopefully the show will continue to have success.
Well, that's the beautiful thing. Is they lean into his age. They don't try to disguise his age. He is an aging gentleman of leisure, so he can play this as long as the show's good. He can play it indefinitely.
And there's something great about towards the end of the first season when they go back to the cabin.
They go back to the cabin in the second season.
I know, but that first time,
yeah, you see it like
and it's like, and they've so much. It seems like so much detail was put into like making it fucking the cabin from Evil Dead 2.
Yeah. Because the original cabin has been gone for 37 years. So yeah, because like the fireplace, like the rocks still remain. Like there was some convention where Bruce Campbell, somebody came up who'd been waiting in line, and they plumped a rock down on the desk. And he's like, "What is this?" And he's like, "We went and found the location, and this is the only thing that's still there is the fireplace." So. And
also, what's interesting about his book is that like every chapter opens with like a really fucking ugly email that somebody sent him, and so there's this weird thing about some celebrities, and it doesn't happen to everybody, but I think we all naturally feel like Ash and Bruce Campbell like are our friends, and we can bust his chops in a way that you wouldn't bust somebody else.
Well, he and his friends have a rough sense of humor, and so you're like, that's what kind of draws us to him is their sensibility. Like, it's like a specific code, and yeah, you can tell like they've got their inside jokes, and they're kind of inviting us to enjoy it for a couple of hours. So.
Yeah, and I think that's part of the longevity of it. It's like we feel like we're in on it in some way, and I think that's one of the reasons why it works as well as it does.
Well, it's a fascinating saga. I'm all in. I've been a fan since I was a teenager. Going now into my 40s, the fact that we have a season 3 on its way, I couldn't be more excited to follow it in real time because I was a fucking idiot and wasn't following this damn show. And it's a show.
You really were. Had I known this, I would have spoken up.
Yeah, it wasn't until I saw the poster for Ash vs. Evil Dead 3, I was like, that's a fucking really good poster. Like, it's an astonishingly good poster of him, like, with the chainsaw raised upright and the shotgun pointed down towards, like, a monster's maw. Yeah, they knocked that poster out of the park. Yeah,
it's a fun show. I mean, I don't know what the general response is from, like, the diehard Evil Dead fans, but I can't imagine that anybody has a real issue with it.
Yeah, I mean, Stars is just secretly, suddenly, like, just cranking out all these cool shows, so I'm in their corner.
Yeah, it probably doesn't cost a whole lot to make in the grand scheme of things, and
if it raises the number of people subscribing to their app, then it's totally worth it.
Look, if you said to me, 6 or 7 years ago, that by this point, I would have seen Goblin live, I would have seen John Carpenter live, and that I would be able to watch a weekly television show of Ash versus the Evil Dead. So what the fuck are you smoking?
Yeah. Well, I don't think we can end on a better note than that. So I can't thank you enough for pitching this topic because it's one of those things where it's like, it blows my mind. I've been doing this podcast for a long time. How have we not tackled this subject yet? But I feel like we did it justice to the best of our ability.
Without going 3.5 hours like we've done in the past.
Absolutely. Well, we're good. But, I think it's like 2.5 hours. Still not a short podcast, but if people want to continue this conversation or read your book or listen to your podcast, give people all the vital stats that they need to know.
I just started. You can go to All Things Scored to Death at scoredtodeath.com. You can also buy the book on there, and I can sign it. The book's also available on Amazon and some of the record distributors like Two Headed Dogs and Lights in the Attic. I think they carry it as well. And you could also probably order from your local bookstore. The podcast has Scored to Death. The podcast is finally up. The first episode just went up, which is part 1 of an in-depth interview with Richard Band, which I think it turned out really great, which is one of the reasons why I decided to make it the first episode. Episode 2, I don't know when this is going to post, but it might be up already. But that's already pretty much available everywhere on Libsyn. It's on iTunes. Right now, you can even listen to it on YouTube. So most places that you get podcasts, that's available. on Twitter and Facebook and Instagram at Scored to Death. And then, of course, there's the Saturday Night Movie Sleepovers podcast, which is available as most of the same places as Sat Sleepovers on Twitter. And we have a pretty lively, fun Facebook community for that, where we post a lot of things and we interact with people. I think probably even more than Scored to Death, the people that listen to your show will probably enjoy Saturday Night Movie Sleepovers.
Very cool.
Scored to Death is very good, a very good representation of what I did the book. So if you're into really movie making, like the book, it's kind of under the guise of horror movie music, but it's really, for the most part, celebrating the people that create music for movies. And right, we focus on a lot of people that make movie music for horror movies, but the interviews are a lot more about the process of filmmaking and the process of creating music for film. So if you're a film score fan, I think you'll really enjoy it. If you're a horror fan, I think you'll enjoy it. And if you're just a film lover and interested in the process of making movies, I think you might enjoy it as well. Yeah. I tried to get into the relationship, and if you want to make movies, I think listening to what these guys have to say will be helpful. So a lot of pokers in the fire.
Beautiful. Well, keep on poking. And you're welcome back on Wrong Reel anytime you want to talk about all of the above, or I feel like we got David Cronenberg and Chuck Jones still on our to-do list, so we will tackle those at some point. But we hope you all have enjoyed this podcast. Please consider giving it a subscribe. A great way to help the podcast is leaving a review and a rating on iTunes or whatever platform you might be listening to it on. And yeah, you can find us Facebook, Twitter, all the usual spots, and you can find my personal profile at Colbrax. And we got a couple episodes coming up in the near future, but I can't remember what they are off the top of my head, so I'm just going to let y'all, enjoy that mystery while it lingers and lasts for the next couple of days. But thank you so much for listening. We greatly appreciate it. And as always, onwards and upwards.